Okay, going live. I wanted to investigate the beginning of life, or the origin of life. So I'm going to follow this video, more or less. It's basically following the rabbit hole. We're going down the rabbit hole of the origin of life according to evolutionists and the creationist take on that origin of life. I don't know how this is coming through. Somehow this thing's not working. Anyway, I'll try this.
My background is in science. I do have a doctorate in nuclear physics, but I'm also a Bible scholar. I've taught from the Bible through many different books, and the challenge to me as a believer always is, do science and the Bible complement each other, or is there a real conflict between them? And my view is that the Bible and science are complementary to each other.
Okay, to begin with, the Bible is what we can know. And, science is what we can know. Science is what we can determine. It's all about truth, what the truth is. Somehow, I don't even know if this is right. Hold on a second. Should be right, but never know. Anyway, I'll just go with it. Science is what we can know. The Bible tells us what the truth is. Don't confuse that. Theology is the highest form of science that there is. There is no other higher form of science than theology. Theology is knowing the truth. The truth is that we have a maker, and the truth is that everything is subject to that maker of the universe. Okay, so get that straight. Science is knowing, or it's a method of knowing what the facts are. The Bible is dealing in facts. The Bible is telling you what the facts are. And the Bible is true regarding creation, because nothing can make itself. It has to be made. So let's just follow this rabbit hole here.
And we have the evidence for that. The more science finds out, the more we see that the Bible is true scientifically. And this talk I put together, it's called Evolution Showstopper. And I've challenged skeptics with this. I've put this out on my website a number of times already and challenged skeptics. I present 4 different arguments on why evolution can't even get started, which I'm going to discuss tonight. I said, show me where I'm wrong. Nobody has come back and showed me this. So show this to your friends who are unbelievers, and challenge them to find a hole in my arguments. Or if they are believers, show them this, because this will encourage them in their faith. So the talk is called Evolution Showstopper.
Hole in their head.
So let's jump into that. I'm going to go through a little bit of introduction. What is the biblical worldview of life, and then also look at what does evolution say about life. And you'll see that they conflict with each other quite significantly. I'm going to go through another few discussions on these topics of chance, necessity, and design. You might say, what's that all about? Well, I'll explain in a minute. The lecture I'm giving here, in terms of evolution, if we have evolution, Darwinian evolution, there must be a first cell for evolution to even get started. And of course,
Right. In order to have evolution, you have to have a first life. The thing is that you can't have evolution without having the first life. And evolution and abiogenesis both have the same problem of getting information that's not there, obviously. So there really is no difference between abiogenesis and evolution like they want you to believe, like evolutionists want to believe. They say evolution, is only after life started. No, it's the same problem. It's the same problem of not being able to get the information to evolve or to exist, for that matter. It's the same problem. It's a problem of information. It's not complicated.
of course, for that first cell to come, according to evolution, there's got to be a beginning to the universe. Those three steps, and I'll explain what I mean. So, but this lecture is going to be focused on the middle one there. What about the origin of first life by natural procedures? Is that even possible? And I'm going to look at four aspects of that. The law of biogenesis, the formation of components of life, the law of mathematical probability, and information, the source of information. So with that in mind, let me jump in here. The biblical view of life, I think you understand. You can understand right from the very first chapter of Genesis. In the first chapter of Genesis, God uses the word kinds 10 times. Everything was created according to its kind and reproduced according to its kind. So that's how we view life. And when you look at the fossil record carefully, you'll see that it does support that, and I'm sure Chris will show that in his talk on the 15th as well. So that's pretty simple. We have dog kinds, cat kinds, cow kinds, human kind, all those different kinds. And there's no mixing between them at all. They're all separate.
Okay, there is the distinction that on the ark there was a difference between ravens and birds. So right there we have two kinds of birds. So it's likely, possible, unlikely, probable that there were other things, similar things, that had different kinds too as well, like maybe, say, foxes and dogs or wolves or whatever. And maybe they did come from the same kind, but maybe they were both on the ark. I don't know. But it seems to me that there were different cat kinds on the ark. Because, I suppose it's possible to have variation between a tiger, a lion, and a jaguar. And in 100 years. But the evidence seems to me to be that 100 years after the flood, the continent split and the jaguars and leopards were separated, along with the greater grison and the honey badger and many other animals. Okay, that split happened in the days of Peleg, if you believe that it was talking about the continents split in part, the earth was divided. It says the earth was divided. It doesn't say people were divided. But, which is a big thing, it's a big difference between saying the earth was divided and people were divided. Because it does say people were divided too, into families. But it also says the earth was divided in the days of Peleg, which was I think just before or after the flood. I think it's just before the flood. I mean, just before the split of the continents. And it's interesting. The Bible even talks about that, about the earth being divided. But since there were different kinds of birds, there could have been different kinds of cats, different kinds of bears, different kinds of different things. And it's a possibility in my mind.
Separate kinds, the fossil record shows that as well. What does evolution say? Well, 3 major points. First of all, we're all related through common ancestry. Every life that we see, plant or animal, started from one living cell. So the question is, where did that living cell come from? And then once you have that living cell, the cell duplicates, multiplies, and then differentiation comes through mutations and natural selection. That's according to the theory of evolution. And how's this done? Random chance processes of nature. And as atheists like Dawkins will want to say, is that evolution has no direction, no plan, nothing. It's just all random chance processes. So in that story, Darwin didn't address the origin of the first living cell, but in a later writing, he surmised that life could have started in some primordial soup in the early Earth.
Yeah, I don't know why the volume is so low. I'm trying to get it up. I'm using this thing here. I think it's controlling my volume somehow. But I'm using a mic, and I was supposed to take care of the problem, but it doesn't seem, unless I get right up into it, it doesn't even seem to work very well. It's hardly even registering. I don't know why. But I'll work on that.
If all the components were there in that primordial soup, they all got together, and voila, there's a first living cell. Could that happen? And so you know the rest of the story, evolution. If you have the first living cell, bacteria, more complex cells, primitive cells, fish, amphibians, mammals, birds, apes, and then us, humankind. That's the evolution story. That is not according to the Bible at all. So how do evolutionists explain this?
Hold on a second. Chemicals don't have information. You have to agree that chemicals don't have any information. I'm addressing Wildheart's assertion or suggestion that chemicals have information. They don't have any information. They are sequenced into an order that contains the information. But the chemicals don't have any information intrinsic to themselves. The information has to be placed into the chemicals, or the chemicals have to be arranged in an order so that the information can be stored or utilized. And of course, if that order is changed, then that changes the information. But the DNA is accurate enough so that it doesn't make that many mistakes. And that's it's good enough so that we haven't gone extinct in 6,000 years. That's how accurate DNA is in duplication and repair and rearranging itself so that it works in spite of the errors. Because if you have errors early on, that life form is not going to be viable because it's going to affect everything down the line. You have to understand that every mistake there is initially in the duplication process in the when a life form is being created, after you recombine the information from male and female, that has to be accurately duplicated, because if it's not, every mistake is going to be replicated on down the line, and the life form is not going to be viable. So we have genetic mistakes sometimes on our skin, but that's all the way down at the end of the line. So the genetic errors are at the end of the line, not the beginning of the line. So we might have a bump on our face or something. That's a genetic error at the end of the line. If that mistake was earlier, that would have been a lot more serious. And of course, if it was a little bit earlier, it would be a big bump on your face or a large mark on your skin or whatever. But anyways, it has to be accurate, and it is very accurate. But the information doesn't come from chemicals. The information comes from other than chemicals, because the chemicals can't even determine what they are. Chemicals are forced to be what they are, and they do what they're concatenated to do, or ordered to do, or basically directed but to do. And that's the evidence of God. You know, we can see that no natural thing is able to write direction or make a directed working mechanism such as we consist of.
Well, they use a point of view of scientific materialism, and what is that? It's a belief claiming that physical matter is the only or fundamental reality, and that all organisms, processes, and phenomena can be explained as manifestations of interactions of matter. So everything can be explained in terms of matter and energy and time. And Einstein's theory equation, E equal mc squared. Energy and mass, they are conserved in total, but they can go from energy can go to mass can go to energy, but the total energy in the universe is constant. And they say everything can be explained in terms of the matter and energy and changes over time. But the other thing we have to realize is that we are familiar with the scientific method. We come up with a theory, we propose some tests that can be used to test the theory, experiments. We run the experiments, we get some results, and see if they match the theory. If they don't, we may modify it somewhat. And if we get something that seems to support the theory, we can ask a colleague to do the same thing, run the same experiment, and see if they get the same result.
Okay, let me just continue addressing Wildheart's question. He said, could information in DNA not be natural? My question would be, how could DNA be natural? What natural process is there that writes information that's not there? There really is no process to write information that's not there. Chemicals, exactly. Chemicals react the way they're made, according to their properties of how they react. And so that means you can't get information by any natural source. Yeah, it's no problem. I just like to address the questions that people have. But the fact that chemicals are directed proves that there's a director, because you can't use directed things as evidence of no direction, because it's evidence of direction, and that is evidence of your maker, who is not natural, who is not physical. So the information is not physical, and your maker is not physical. The information is superimposed on the chemicals, or in the concatenation of the chemicals. So it's not a natural thing. Your existence is not natural. Your existence is supernatural. Every birth is a supernatural event in the sense that it is from information that is not natural. Okay, I'll try to keep going with the video here.
That's okay today, but what about in the past? You can't test things that happened in the past. You can't test creation. You can't test evolution. You've got to use a different method to come up to your conclusions. And normally, one way I like to describe it is using forensic science. And, when we try to...
Yeah, let me just say one thing here. I don't exactly agree that you can't test creation because of what I just said. That we observe the creation every time a child is born. That child didn't exist, and that child is a unique person like no other that has ever been. That is a creation of a living being by a pre-existing written word, recombination of a pre-existing written word, right before our eyes every day. And when people have a child, you get the sense of awe, but then you forget about it. You forget about the fact that there was a creation right in front of your eyes. There was a creation of an individual by a pre-existing written word right in front of your eyes. So creation is observable the same way that God created the worlds in the universe and every living thing by His word, by a pre-existing written word. A child was created. So we see creation every day if you go to the hospital. So that's one of my pet peeves, is that yes, we do observe creation, and we don't, and it's by a pre-existing written word. It's not complicated.
Solve a crime, and the suspect, nobody observed the crime, and so how do we find the suspect? We look at evidence. And today, of course, we use DNA, and that's a very good way to identify potential suspects. And we can do the same thing with the world that we see today. We can look at fossils as believers. Evolutionists can look at fossils. We're looking at the same fossils. Fossils are not labeled according to time or, this is a transitional fossil or not. We have to look at the evidence and determine that. So how do we distinguish between science, history, and belief? This is one way to look at it. Science, you think of things that you can test in the present, you can observe them, you can test them, and it's repeatable. You can run repeat experiments and see what results you get. That's science. But if something happened in the past, And there were eyewitnesses, so there was somebody to record them. That's called history. But if it happened in the past and there were no eyewitnesses, at least human eyewitnesses, then, and obviously it's not repeatable, then that's a belief system. And in that sense, creation and evolution are both belief systems. Evolution.
Except again that creation is observed right in front of your eyes every time a child is born. A life is created by a pre-existing written word right before your eyes.
Is too. Evolution is not good science, as we can see. Science does not back up evolution. The other concept I want to get across, excuse me, that everything can be explained in terms of these three concepts. Either it happened by chance, with random things happen, and it's just a chance event. Or there's a law of nature which causes that to happen. For example, if I put my foot over the podium here, which way am I going? Up or down? Always down, 100%. That's what we call a law of nature. It's fixed, and you'll always go down. However, if it can't be described by one of those two concepts, then it must be designed. There's intelligence behind what we see. And if you apply that to these faces on the mountain, you'll see the only credible explanation is they were designed and carved into the mountain. It didn't happen because of the way the rain fell on the mountain that carved out these faces. There was an intelligent agent behind it and a design. So,
hold on a second. I just had a wisecrack here from Theodore. No, that's okay. But I want to respond to it if I can. Theodore said, reproduction is not creation. That's it's a recreation. But it is a creation. I mean, it's no different than the first creation, except that it's just a continued recreation of the same first creation, and it's right before our eyes. So there's that.
to put this first life into perspective, I just want to summarize the three major stages of evolution that we consider in science. The first is, and this is secular science, cosmic evolution. Many secular scientists believe that we got here through the Big Bang. So the Big Bang, a singularity exploded, and here we have the galaxies, the stars, and the planets, and all that came from there. And second, they would say at some point, first life started on Earth. And so, secular scientists would say that life started on Earth about 4.5 billion years ago or so. And so, what are the conditions necessary for that to happen? Is that even possible? And that's what we're going to address in this lecture.
Okay, I have, obviously, from a previous video, that I have my own ideas of how the universe was created. And it's not from a single point. What's being explained here is the cosmic development of the universe, because there is no evolution. Evolution doesn't exist. Everything, it's all cause and effect. It's not, there is no evolving of something that wasn't there, which is the reason why everything didn't come from a single point where there's no time and no space. Because you can't have all the energy in the universe in a single point. And of course they think it was extremely hot and they say because of gravity, Stephen Hawking says because of gravity, there was a Big Bang. But how can you have gravity if you don't have matter? It's the chicken and the egg problem. So you have to have the creation of matter, and the creation of matter requires energy, which doesn't come from a single point, a single physical point. It comes from energy that has to have already been there. And check this out. It can't come from lesser and lesser energy making more and more energy. That's not physically possible. It has to come from a greater and greater source of energy. In other words, the energy that made the universe has to have been a greater source of energy. And whatever source of energy that was or is, had to have a greater source of energy. So it's an infinite regress of greater and greater energy until you arrive at an all-powerful creator. That's what the evidence is showing you. That's what the science is. We were talking about science earlier. That's what science is. It's looking at the facts. That energy can't make itself. Energy can't order itself. So the energy in the universe, not only was it made, the energy in the universe was ordered or bunched up or wound up like a spring. So energy can't wind itself up. Energy can't make itself. It has to come from a greater and greater source of energy or power, not a lesser and lesser source. So this is observational science. This is observational facts that prove an all-powerful maker of the universe.
And then third stage is really what I call biological evolution or Darwinian evolution, where from the first cell, the cells start to differentiate, they duplicate, reproduce, and then start to differentiate, and that's how you get all the diverse life in the world. That's what evolution would say. So those three stages of evolution we can talk about. But in this case, I want to talk about the origin of first life. So I said there's 4 points I'm going to discuss that would show that first life cannot start by random chance processes. And I'll use these 4 arguments. First one is the law of biogenesis, which states that in nature, life comes only from life and that of its kind. That's what we define as the law of biogenesis. Thousands of years ago, Greek philosophers thought that life could generate spontaneously from non-living material. And that's how people thought until just a few hundred years ago. There was some discussion about, well, let's run an experiment to see if we can get life to start from non-living material.
Okay, Wildheart asked a good question. Let me see if I can get to it. If you are arguing that DNA is too complex to happen naturally, an incredibly complex creator who has always existed makes no sense. Well, it does, because it has to be an eternally complex. It has to be infinitely complex, infinitely powerful, infinite wisdom, understanding, and power and perfection. Okay, but let me address this one thing about complexity. It's not about complexity. It's about instruction. It's about significant sequencing. It's not about being complicated. It's not complicated. It's just put into a specific order. Energy is put into order. It can't put itself into order. DNA is put into directed working order. It can't put itself into order. Now, this is all evidence of God. This is evidence in your face, evidence of God. I mean, at this point, you're just arguing. I mean, pointlessly. It's just pointless to argue against the Maker when all of the evidence is of your Maker. There is no evidence of not having a Maker. It's all evidence of having a Maker.
Material. And these four scientists ran experiments, and the most significant is the last one of 1864, Pasteur, but they concluded conclusively that you can't have life start from non-living material. It's impossible. And that's a law. That's still regarded as a law. So there are other hypotheses proposed over the last century, and we're going to look at some of those as well. But basically, the law of biogenesis has never been falsified. Here's some important milestones we might remember in this discussion. You'll remember that Darwin wrote his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And significantly, there was a big argument between Darwin and other scientists of that day, including Pasteur, and he showed conclusively 5 years later that it's impossible to start life from non-living material.
Yeah, so if it's put into a complex order, that means that there's infinite wisdom in God, there's infinite power, there's infinite understanding. It can't be bottom up, it has to be top down. Everything has to be top down. Nothing is bottom up. Energy is not bottom up. Information is not bottom up. Power and everything has to be top down. Instruction has to be top down. It can't be bottom up. That's what the evidence is. I mean, you could say that it doesn't make sense, but it's the only thing that does make sense. It has to be top down, not bottom up, because that's what the evidence is showing us, not the other way around. It can't be both. It can't be any other thing. It has to be top down. It can't be anything else.
Biogenesis is impossible. And then I'm sure you've heard of the Miller's experiment, where Miller ran an experiment where he tried to show that some of the components of life could start under certain conditions in the early Earth. And then in the same year, as a matter of fact, the discovery of the DNA double helix. And from this and further science after that, we know that the DNA is where the information is in our living cells. Darwin had no idea about that before he came up with his theory. And then I'm sure you're familiar with the intelligent design movement. The Discovery Institute here in Seattle is a big prime mover of that movement. There is a creation scientist, Dr. Gitt, who is an expert on information, and he's developed some laws of information which have been shown to be true and never been shown to be false. And significantly, in 2009, there was a meeting of 16 leading evolutionists, they know that the mechanism of mutations and natural selection doesn't work. There's no way it can work. So these people met in Austria to try and come up with a new way of explaining that. Excuse me. And they were, of course, unsuccessful in doing that. First of all, let me just remind you this. The philosophers, the Greek philosophers, they promoted spontaneous generation. And they had no access to information like microscopes or telescopes to tell much more. And so they just believed that, yes, life just started from non-life spontaneously. So that belief held sway for 2,000 or more years until Pasteur came along, 1864, and put that to rest. So that experiment shows that life just cannot start from non-living material. Nobody's ever shown that to be false, that law. So that should be the end of my talk. If you can't get the first living cell, you're not going to have evolution.
Right. And this is the point. I mean, I wonder why people even believe in evolution or try to argue or make a case for evolution or make a case for no God when all the evidence is of God. It's just that they're so blinded by their own lies, their own disbelief, and basically their own sin, that they can't see the obvious truth, the elephant in the room. And to me, there's no question, there's never been a question of whether or not there is a God, ever. I just don't see how somebody can deny the existence of God. I mean, our own existence is enough evidence. We also have the existence of the universe. We have the existence of all living forms, life forms. Everything is evidence of God. It all comes from God. All power comes from God. The king comes from God. The ruler comes from God. Everything operates by the power given to them by God. And not to say that they are like God or have the characteristics of God, but the power they use is from God. And it's just so clear and so obvious to me. And of course there's going to be an accounting for everything everybody does with the power given to them by God.
Work is impossible. But let's go on. Well, first of all, Pasteur's experiment, I should show that too here. He had a protected environment where he kept out dust and particles, and without that in the jar, in a very protected jar, it shows the life just cannot start spontaneously. So there's more to say about that, but the conclusion is there is no way to start life from non-living components. So then the second point I want to go over is what components of life are we talking about? We know this today. Darwin had no idea what the components of life were in his day. So he just thought life was just our bodies were made of blobs which somehow reproduced, and but he had no way of determining what was in those blobs. He just thought, well, that's the way it works. Today, we know a lot more. And the major components of a living cell, which you see at the bottom here, it's very complex. The components such as the nucleus, chromosomes, proteins, RNA, DNA, that's all in that cell. Very complicated. And another important thing is there's a cell membrane. It's necessary to have a membrane for the interactions that happen in the cell to even work. These interactions can't happen outside of the membrane. So in an early Earth atmosphere, where would you get that membrane for these actions to happen? They can't. So these components are important for a living cell. And it turns out that the proteins, to create proteins, you need DNA. Well, where'd the DNA come from? Well, some scientists will say, well, there's an RNA. If things really, RNA is simpler than DNA. First, living materials started with RNA, and then eventually you got DNA. But again.
Okay, Wildheart says everything is evidence of God if you start off believing there is a God. No, you look at the evidence that is, and the evidence determines what you believe. And if you don't look at what the evidence is, you're not going to know what the truth is. If you ignore the evidence, then you're ignoring the truth. So you start off looking at things that exist and determine their origin, and determine that they can't make themselves, they can't order themselves, neither energy nor biological forms can order themselves, and you determine from that evidence that there's a maker. I mean, it's the logical, rational conclusion, and there is no evidence to the contrary. And I don't see any problem. I don't see what the problem is. I mean, because there is no evidence to the contrary.
Again, it's a chicken and egg. It just can't happen. So that's the high-level picture. You'll see in the top there, which is important when we come to the discussion, is that the proteins consist of amino acids. And in the in Miller's experiment, he tried to show that it's possible to form amino acids. And what he hoped to show was, starting at the top, these the amino acids and nucleotides. The amino acids produce the proteins, and then he hoped to get some kind of a protocell, which then could explain how we got to the complex cell we have today. That's sort of what he was trying to show. So he thought, if I could show that the amino acids could be formed in an early Earth environment, then I've shown that we can start life on early Earth. Well, what did he produce? Notice that this is not a random occurrence. This is a designed experiment in the first place. There's intelligence involved in creating the experiment. So it's not happening out in this early Earth environment. It's a very protected environment. And the gases he chose turned out not to be correct. And the explosion with this electrode here produced some things like amino acids.
Yeah, Wildheart wants to know when I first believed in God, and if it was because of the evidence or because of what I was taught. It turns out that I was taught the truth. You know, that's what the difference is between people in the world and people that are raised with the teaching of God is that nobody else is taught the truth. When you're taught the truth, then you're way ahead of the game. That means that you don't have to go back and relearn something. You don't have to be fooled because you weren't told that Santa Claus exists. You were told the truth. So you don't have to go back and relearn everything. You don't have to be confused by anything because you already know what the deal is. You already understand that the world is evil. You understand that only God is good and that only He can be your Savior. And if you're not raised with the truth, then you're at a very much at a disadvantage when it comes to knowing the truth, because you're misled, you're thrown off the rails. And so it's that much harder for you because of what you were taught. And it mostly reflects on your parents and your teachers in school, because that's where you got your information from. So if they misled you, you're going to be misled. You're not going to understand. Now, over the years, I can see what I was told that was true and what I was told that's not true. And I was given a great advantage by being taught initially the truth of creation. And it remains true. It holds up scientifically. And that's how the children suffer because of their parents. Because their parents throw them off from ever knowing the truth. Wildheart says, it's lucky so you didn't start believing based on evidence. You just believed what you were told. But it was based on evidence. It's just whether I could see the evidence or not, it was based on evidence, because what they were telling me was true, because the truth is evident. Now, the adults that were teaching me were being responsible with the evidence, and they were telling me the truth. And then when I grow up and am able to think for myself, I can confirm that what they told me was true and based on evidence. So it's still based on evidence regardless. And it's just unfortunate that there are so many unbelievers that don't know the truth and can't tell the truth. They're not able to tell the truth because they were never explained the truth or told the truth so that they could understand the truth. And but it's not that it was not based on evidence. It is based on evidence. It's just that I believed what I was told, and I wasn't told there was a Santa Claus. I was told the truth. So I believe the truth, and I continue to believe the truth to this day. So it's based on evidence. You just didn't know what the evidence was. That seems odd. No. Well, to the best of my knowledge as a kid, I could see that it was true. And I believed what they were saying was true, based on everything I understood as a child. And a child can understand easily these things that we're talking about. A child is not stupid, and even though a child can be manipulated and misled very easily, doesn't mean that you can't understand or don't know what's going on. Because I did make a decision as a child to tell the truth as best that I understood. So it was based on the evidence that I had available to me, and I was being given evidence as I was growing up, and it remains true to this day, the evidence that I was given as a child. There can only be one truth, and I was told that one truth, that only your Maker can be your Savior, nobody else can be. Well, I don't know, I believed it when I was told the truth, and I still believe it because nobody has proven anything to the contrary based on the evidence. So it's always based on evidence because creation is evident, and the Bible actually says that creation is evident.
But it produced more products like tars that were not part of life, obviously. So yes, it did produce some amino acids, but let's take a look at that. First of all, there are numerous problems with them, and I'll show you some of the major ones here. If there's oxygen in the early atmosphere, you can't even form amino acids. And he assumed there was no oxygen in the early atmosphere. Well, if there's no oxygen, then the ultraviolet rays would destroy the amino acids. Amino acids can't form in an unprotected environment. And if they're formed in water, water decomposes bonds. And so the components couldn't start that way. What his experiment produced was some amino acids, but it produced the wrong amino acids. His experiment, first of all, produced 50% left-handed amino acids and 50% right-handed. Some of the left-handed amino acids were close to what's required for life, but life is comprised only of left-handed amino acids. So again, you produce something that couldn't survive.
And again, there has to be 20 amino acids. You can't have life unless you have those 20 left-handed amino acids, and they have to be significantly sequenced to make the protein. Plus, you have to have the information to make the protein. Not only do you have to have the protein, you have to have the information to make the protein at the same time, because it's the proteins that protect the information, and it's the information that makes the proteins.
The low concentration of the products that were produced, there are many more contaminants, and we have to remember this didn't happen by chance. This was a designed experiment. So then the scientists later tried to say, well, maybe we didn't find the right primordial soup where life could have started, perhaps in the bottom of the sea where there's hydrothermal vents at the right temperature that could possibly serve as the source of that, or volcano springs. But all of these other possible sources of where life could have started didn't pan out.
The difference, Wild Heart, is that I'm believing what the evidence shows, and there is no evidence to the contrary. It's not a fallacy to believe something based on evidence. I mean, take for example what you believe. Is what you believe based on evidence? or is it wrong? Is it a fallacy? Is your object credit giving, is that a fallacy? And of course, yes it is, because there's no evidence of objects doing anything of their own intent, or they can't make a directed working mechanism. So we continue.
It just doesn't work. So then some scientists said, well, maybe life started in space, or and maybe somehow that life got transmitted to Earth through some comet or some other mechanism. But if that didn't work, well, maybe somebody intelligent being from outside planted, beginning of living cells on the Earth, and that's how life started. Well, that doesn't solve the problem. That just moves the problem to a different place. And so that doesn't work. And here's some quotes, and I use these quotes just from scientists who are unbelievers. They believe in evolution. And here's what Yoki says. He's an atheist, and just reading the underlying parts, he says, a scenario describing the genesis of life on Earth by chance and natural causes, which can be accepted on the basis of fact and not faith, has not yet been written. So he admits, we don't have the answer. Another one here, Dr. Orgel, he said, I must admit that attempts to reconstruct this evolutionary process are extremely tentative. So again, they don't have the answer. This is very complicated, how to put all the components of life together. Darwin, of course, had no idea about the complexity of how to put all this together and how that would reproduce and differentiate. So, but today, science, we know that. So the third thing there's two strikes against it. The third one, if you look at the law of mathematical probability, can you form life from non-living components by chance? And you look at crazy examples like second one here. What's the probability of creating a Boeing airplane, which consists of 5 million non-flying parts in a huge junkyard with all the right components of the airplane? How you think there's any chance of that come together? No way. What about the forming a protein? Just one simple protein. We have more than 100,000 different proteins, types of proteins in our body. Can we form even one protein by random chance? We ask that question. First of all, what is a protein? Well, it consists of amino acids in a very specific order. There are a few thousand types of amino acids, but remember they come in left-handed and right-handed. And life, the proteins, the building blocks of life, contain large organic molecules, contain hundreds to even thousands of amino acids in a very specific order. And the only amino acids they can use to form the proteins is 20 specific left-handed amino acids. So all those thousands kinds of amino acids, only the 20 specific left-handed amino acids make up a protein. And if you get a working protein, and if you were to take one of those amino acids out or add another one, it just doesn't work. It's not a working protein. So it is very specific requirements. Let's look at the mathematical probability. I'm not going to take you through all the math here, but basically, if you consider a protein of 200 amino acids in a very specific order, and you look at the ways you can align them, it comes to a number like 10 to the power of 375. And if you were trying to come up with different alignments, let's say a few billion per second, if that's what's possible to do, even if you assume that the universe is
thing, people think that there's still a chance that life could have possibly formed by accident, but that is an appeal to infinite possibilities in limited time and space. This is important because you have to have the space and you have to have the time. In other words, for multiple possibilities, you need more space and you need time for it to occur. And there's not enough time for unlimited possibilities in limited time and space. I mean, if you're appealing to infinite possibilities, that is the exact same thing as appealing to God. You are appealing to God, a physical God or magical God, because there's not enough time and space, in limited time and space, for infinite possibilities, or even the amount of possibilities to make a single protein from 20 left-handed amino acids. And they would obviously fall apart before they ever put themselves into directed working order. The whole idea is absolutely absurd. Totally absurd.
13, 14 billion years old, there's still not enough time to form the right sequence and form a protein. Probability comes down to 1 in 10 to the 356. But there are only 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the whole universe. So, and mathematicians have determined that anything less than 1 in 10 to the power of 50 is impossible. Just can't happen. Impossible. So these numbers are so small that it's impossible even to form one living protein. How simple can life be? Well, we know today, and of course Darwin knew none of this. Look at a small bacteria. Take one number there, 580,000 DNA base pairs, letters, make up that bacteria. That's quite a few. The human genome has 3 billion of those DNA base pairs. The probability of forming the bacteria is 0, mathematically 0. So if you can't even form that, you're certainly not going to get accomplished.
Well, the difference, Wildheart, the difference is that I believe in a maker who is infinite in potential and possibility and power. That's the difference. See, an infinite maker can make a finite world. A finite world can't make infinite possibilities. It's not complicated.
Complex human being out of that. And remember, this is all due to the complexity of the human cell. If you look at one there, you know, we don't have to go over all the components, but you can just see. I mean, one of the important things is the membrane around all that, because all the interactions within the cell could not operate without a membrane. And so it's a very special environment. You've got the proteins, the mitochondria, nucleus, chromosomes, you know, you name it, all those parts in there. And we have 75 trillion of those in our body. So just think of the mathematical probability associated with that. And I'm sure you all remember how we determine probability, you know, flipping a coin and coming up heads. You know, you have half a chance, 50% chance of coming up heads every time you flip it. And you can do the multiplication. Trying to get just 10 heads in a row, for example, it's a chance of 1 in 1,000. You have to try 1,000 times. If you want to go as far as 10,000 or 1,000 heads in a row, you get a number like 10 to the 300. Well, that just can't happen. Mathematically, anything less than 1 in 10 to the 50th just is not going to happen. So if you apply that to life, and let's take an example of a protein that has just 400 amino acids. the probability of getting that by random chance process is 1 in 10 to the power of 240. A single cell that you see at the bottom right there, what's the chance of all the parts of that cell coming together by random chance process?
Look at this number. This is a crazy number. It's not even physically possible. Look, 10 to the 40th thousandth. It's just, I mean, people talk about science this and science that. This is science. This is truth. This is fact. Look, that's an obscene number. That's an absurd number. That is just, I mean, and you want to continue to believe that mindless matter made itself and ordered life with that kind of lack of a possibility. It's just absurd.
Well, it's just, oops, sorry. That's just not going to happen. Because again, that number of atoms in the universe, 10 to the power of 80, and that is, this number 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. Law of probability says anything less than 1 in 10 to the 50 just cannot happen. So you can see the complexity of that cell. By random chance process, it's just not going to come together. Here's a quote from a mathematician in the UK. He's not a believer, but he came up with a mathematical calculation and came up with that number 40,000 knots. The probability is 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. It's just not going to happen. And he admits they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. There's just no way that a first living cell can happen by a random chance process. Impossible. So then we come to the fourth reason why this just can't work, and that is life requires information. There's information in life. The only difference between non-living material and living material is information, and I'll explain what I mean. Remember that the evolutionists, atheists, they assume that everything can be explained in terms of mass and energy, two material things. But there's another non-material entity that we need to consider, and that's information. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go through this. So life consists, I would submit that life consists of mass and energy, which is material, and information, which is non-material. It has no weight, but it uses storage to store the information. Information in life is encoded in the DNA of our living cells. Information, if I look at the definition, has 4 different parts: code, meaning, action, and purpose. Now, what do we mean by that? First of all, there's code. If you think of the English language, there's an alphabet, 26 letters. There's meaning. You can put those letters together into a word, which have meanings. And then there's, you can put that together into a sentence, which is an action, and that the sentence has a purpose. Those 4 things define information. And if you think of sending information from a sender to a recipient here, the only way that the recipient can understand this is if he speaks the same language. In our case, English, German, whatever. Otherwise, it's useful information. So information is an encoded, symbolically represented message conveying expected action and intended purpose. Those 4 things. So let me go through that and explain it with some diagrams here. what is the nature of information? I talked about the alphabet, and we use the letters to form words. If I spill an inkwell, you'll understand that's not information as meaningless, just a blob. But if I use a pen, I can put those letters together into words and sentences like here, and if you can still read script, you can understand that. But if you're just using a typewriter, well, you can certainly read what's on the sand here. There's a 3 words, write in sand. And so we ask the question, did that happen by chance? Was there a law of nature which caused that to happen? Or was there intelligence behind it? Some intelligent agent, a human being, wrote that. And here's a more specific example. Information requires code, letters, numbers, meaning in words, and a sentence with a verb in it. That is the action of the sentence, and then we can surmise the purpose for the sentence from the design there. If I put together words like this, NEOJCT, I don't think you'll recognize this in any language that anybody knows. So those are still, it's complex, but it's not specified. In order to be meaningful, the letters have to be specific and in a particular order. So here is an example of specified complexity. I read this sentence comprised of words and a verb that has meaning and that it has a purpose. And that's what we mean by information. How does that apply to computers? Well, for computer geeks, of course, they know that information is stored as zeros and ones. It's all zeros and ones. And of course, you can look at that, a map of that, but it's meaningless unless you have some way of interpreting that. And computer programmers have languages that they use to create those bits, zeros and ones, so they can understand it. But the other thing I want to point out is that these zeros and ones, they are information, they have no weight. For example, the information in a computer is stored on a disk. If I take all the bits on that disk and zero them out, they're all zero, not random zeros and ones. You think the weight of the disk changes any? No. Whether it's a 0 or 1, doesn't matter. There's no weight change. And this information requires a programmer to produce the information. So there's an intelligent agent behind it. That's our experience. So if you look at the cell, you see that the double helix here with the base pairs in there, that is the information in our cells. And those base pairs are in this cell here. You can print, if you decide to print out what's in there, you could do that. It would take thousands of books to describe just one cell. And I'm not going to explain what all these letters mean, but it is information that geneticists understand. And the DNA is the molecule of life. And our cells, we have the human genome has 46 human chromosomes, 3 billion base pairs up here, and approximately 30,000 genes. That's all in our genome. You think that came about by chance? Not a chance. So what about machines? If you look at these machines, the assembly line, the motors, and another gear system here, integrated circuit, no question, they're all designed. There's an intelligent agent behind that. They didn't happen by chance. We know that. So then what about molecular? We have molecular motors in our bodies, in our cells. You can't feel them running, of course, which is a good thing. But if you look at this here, example, this molecular motor, you'll see gears here which look very much like gears in in a motor that we're used to seeing. And the important thing to recognize, here we come up with a few concepts. The concept of irreducibly complex, what does that mean? That means all the parts need to be there to be functional. The simple example that Dr. Behe gives is the mousetrap, 5 parts. How many mice do you think you would catch if you took one of those parts away? None. They all have to be there. Same thing with our cells. All the parts have to be there to function. And so, yes, we have motors in our body. Okay, then we talk about programs. Well, if you're a computer geek, you know about hardware, system software, and application software. I'm running PowerPoint on my computer here, and that runs on top of the system software, Windows, and the hardware. And what's in there? Well, there are programs. You can see an example on the right-hand side here. You can't read it from where you sit, but that's a Java program, and that can be compiled into those ones and zeros that you see in the computer. That's a program. What about the cell? Well, in the cell, we also have a program, which, remember, I talked about the DNA and the RNA and the proteins. The DNA and RNA are involved in producing the proteins, but the DNA requires proteins to work. So there's that chicken and egg. And even people like Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, he knows and he recognized that the human genome is like a computer program, but far, far more complex, orders of magnitude more complex. You know how complex the Windows operating system is here. This is much more complex. You know that the Windows operating system didn't happen by chance. There are thousands of programmers who produced that. The cell did not happen by chance, and people recognize.
Yeah, see that's important, because here you have Bill Gates. Saying human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. So right there, and that's the truth. And it's an admission that there is a creator far greater than us. It's not complicated. It's easy to understand a point like that. A child can understand a fact like that. And when I was growing up as a child, I understood these things as a child. And I continue to understand them as an adult. And it's based on the evidence, the observable evidence. And every time a child is born, a life is literally created, actually created by a recombination of a pre-existing written word, written program. It's undeniable fact.
Programmers who produced that. The cell did not happen by chance, and people recognize that. So let me move to the next one here. Life requires information, complexity, and design. The information in the living cell is that DNA, and we talked about the left-handed amino acids. Biological systems must have specified complexity, and what I mean by that, the amino acids in a protein must be in a very specific order to work. And it must be irreducibly complex, and now there's all the parts need to be there, or else it won't work. So what's the best explanation for this? It's design, intelligent design. There's an intelligent agent behind that. It just doesn't happen by chance. So if we look at life, the evidence for design, we see it in biology. We see it in the cell, in our genomes. We see that information. But you have atheists, evolutionists, who won't recognize that. Richard Lewontin, here's what he says: urges scientists to embrace a materialism that is absolute and to stick with the material explanations no matter how counterintuitive. They just won't recognize that. Here's two more quotes about living matter and information. Paul Davies, who is an evolutionist, he says, nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. He recognized that. Nobody knows. Werner Gitt, who I referred to before, German information scientist, and also believes in creation. He said there's no known law of nature, no known process, no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate itself in matter.
Yeah, this is what I continue to say. There's no evidence of any physical thing that will write information or instruction or a viable directed working mechanism. It doesn't happen. It cannot happen. It never will happen. It is nonsense to believe that it does happen. It's your belief in magic. You believe in magic if you think that mindless matter can write information. It just does not happen. It's giving glory to mindless matter, which is idolatry. It's a belief in magic. It is not science. It is not the truth. It is your own delusion.
So in summary then, life requires information. I said life is mass and energy, which is material. We can put our hands on that. And then there's information, which is non-material. We can't put our hands on that. So life requires the information stored in the DNA, machines for storage and programming of the DNA, the programs in there for replication, the irreducible complexity, in other words, all parts need to be there, specified complexity to give it meaning, and all that requires an intelligent mind. There's no way that you can form that information by random chance process. It just doesn't work. So life from non-life, not by chance. Information is the basis for life, and information requires an intelligent mind. So we know all that. Atheists know that. Evolutionists know that. Here's a recent quote from Harvard atheist, George Whiteside. He talks on the origin of life, that this problem is one of the big ones in science. It begins to place life and us in the universe. Most chemists believe, as I do, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules in the prebiotic earth. That's what they believe. How did that happen? They have no idea. It's a belief. It's not based on science. And here's another example. Remember that I said everything can be explained in terms of chance, necessity, or law of nature, or design. You look at these scratches on the wall here. The one on the left is questionable, but if you look down below here, you'll see horse heads, cow heads, pig heads drawn on cave walls. Did that happen by chance? Was that some law of nature that required that to happen? Or did somebody carve that on there? I think you'll agree somebody carved it. There's intelligence involved there. So then if you look at the human genome and the human cell, can't you see those are designed? They're much, much more complicated than you see in the scratches on the cave wall. Aren't they designed? Well, let's see what the evolutionist says. Three of them here. Professor Todd, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. And Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist, biology is a study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. They have the appearance, but you won't admit that they were designed. Even Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. They just can't admit. The facts are there, and the conclusions are rather obvious. So, in conclusion then, life by random chance processes. Is that possible? Totally impossible. Well, I give you 4 reasons. You can read them here. I won't go over them in detail. If you have friends who don't believe in creation, they believe in evolution, show them this and ask them how that can possibly work. It doesn't work. It can't work for these 4 reasons. Information is the key to that. You could say the law of biogenesis says, well, 1864, we should have known. Why go any further? Life can't start from non-life. Pasteur knew that. Darwin knew that, but he just came up with that his theory regardless. So, based on this, I would submit evolution can't even get started. And I'm talking about Darwinian evolution now. First of all, first life, you can't get that. It's impossible to get that by chance. It requires an intelligent agent. And I hope I've presented the facts in support of that. And I guess it would take time for some questions if people have questions.
For a few questions, so if you have any, raise your hand. Let me bring the mic around to you. One question at a time, please, and then let me get the mic back to you if you have a second question.
Yes, just recently, we had in the headlines that they have discovered a black hole in some faraway galaxy. So now we've heard many claims by scientists in the past with their theories and everything. What is the significance of this story of a black hole, anyways, in relations to creation and things like that?
Yeah, I know the stories you allude to there, and by the way, have nothing to do with first life, but you have to have the universe in order to get first life, so that's before that. And yes, they have images of what they think are black holes. I mean, remember, they can't see them. You can't see the black holes. They have to measure the effect of the black holes on the surrounding galaxy to come up with those pictures. And I've read some commentaries on creation websites like ICR and AIG, and they're still going through digesting that. And so I think we're going to keep on finding new things in science, and there are some things that are very hard to explain.
Any other questions? All right. Dr. Leclam, was that a hand?
Yes, recently Stephen Hawking died.
I'm sorry?
Isn't that
Stephen?
Stephen Hawking?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was looking for that particle in atomic matter that, anyway, it's a sad commentary, but he still believed in that particle that would show life. And are you familiar with that or comment on it?
I didn't catch the question good.
Yes, the God particle.
So he was looking for a particle that they called the God particle, and
yeah, the Higgs particle.
Higgs
Yeah,
boson.
that was found, supposedly found a number of years ago now. Peter Higgs, who is a theoretical physicist from the UK, he surmised that there's a missing particle in the standard model of particles, and he surmised there must be a Higgs particle to explain that. And with high energy physics in the CERN experiments, they think they found that particle, but they called it, some people called it a God particle, but that's a misnomer. It serves a purpose, but it has nothing to do with the origin of the universe, for example. Yeah, as some of these particles that scientists find, they are created by high energy collisions, and they have a very short half-life. I mean, they disappear in fractions of a second. You don't see them in our, day-to-day life here. They can only be seen with high energy bombardments.
Okay, one more.
I heard one guy say recently that the kind of experiments they're doing with these accelerators, they're smashing.
I'm sorry?
The kind of experiments they're doing with these particle accelerators, that like CERN, are very chancy. I mean, they don't know exactly what they're going to create. They could create a bomb or something, because they're discovering new elements and new relationships, and it's risky at some point.
Well, some people have expressed fear that what they might find might blow up the whole accelerator. That they don't know. That's true, but so far it hasn't produced that.
Any other questions? All right. So we do have an offering plate in the back. If you can help us with the monies that we take up here are dedicated for this specific program and to pay our future speaker honorariums. So make out checks to Cedar Park Church. All the money goes to them. Next week I'm going to be doing a talk on animal design. So very cool, very kid-friendly as well. Just pointing out a lot of newly discovered amazing design features that have been found in animals, as well as technologies that have been developed after studying much of God's creation, what we call biomimicry. So,
okay, I guess that concludes the video pretty much. I'm glad everybody could participate, those who did. And Wildheart is usually around quite often. He goes to other creationists, product makers or video makers or whatever, or content makers. So he should know better, but he hasn't come to the understanding of the truth of God's word yet. But he should be understanding something by now, as much as he's been hanging around. But he's a kind of a good-natured person, So. And he seems to be trying to learn, only he has trouble learning, I guess. But yeah, thanks for participating, Christian Channel, and I hope to be seeing you in the future, and either by way of posts or whatever, and I'll see if I'm not sure if I'm subscribed to you yet. Maybe I'll try to see if I can subscribe to you. So I guess that's good enough for this stream right now, so I'll just go ahead and end it. And God bless everybody. May the truth of God's word enlighten you and lead you into all truth.